Well, I would say about Ramona, she didn't just open doors, she brought in all the sunlight. The room was lighter, it was happier, it was more productive with Ramona in it.
Dr. Paul started early childhood in Oklahoma. It became a nationwide success story of how the 4-year-old program in early childhood education in Oklahoma began, and she was the central of all of that.
Ramona, I think, opened up the door to the fact that all these teachers are important and every teacher makes an impact. But there are no teachers in the state that probably make more of an impact on students and where students are going to be headed than those teachers who teach the youngest in our schools.
She understood children, and she understood those little people and what sponges their minds are and what special people they are. She's her honesty, and I'm sorry, her consistency. She was a complete person. She didn't seek the spotlight for herself. She was a great support system to me.
What Ramona leaves is a legacy of people with the same passion. So these discussions of early childhood will continue because there are people that she opened up the doors to, there are people that she inspired that know it's their role now to carry that forward.
There's just so many different things that go on throughout the day that I hear her voice. I'm a kindergarten teacher now, and there's lots of times throughout my day when I'm teaching and I think about what would Dr. Paul have done.
A couple of things about her that people remember the most were her high heels. She always wore high heels, and if I can say this, she had great legs, and her glasses. And here's a pair that she wore a lot. They had the sparkles on them, and she was known for that. And behind the glasses and inside those high heels, something pretty special.
Okay, well, Dr. Ramona Paul was the Assistant Superintendent of Education in Oklahoma for many years. She worked really tirelessly behind the scenes to help establish a strong universal pre-K program in Oklahoma. And she also was one of the first people to approach Bill and encourage him to talk to the folks in Tulsa because she thought they might just be willing to have Georgetown University evaluate Tulsa's pre-K program. So I think we can safely say that without Dr. Paul, none of us would be here right now. So I wanted to just briefly introduce myself. I am Beth Malloy. I am an independent early childhood research and policy consultant. And it's interesting, everyone has kind of been taking a moment to reflect on their journey as it relates to universal pre-kindergarten. And I can say, you know, from the time I was here a decade ago, working on the Tulsa Pre-K project, I'm now working with the California Department of Education to stand up their universal pre-K program, which my child, my toddler is 2.5, will get to be a benefactor of. And so that's just really exciting reflection. So I have the pleasure of introducing our panel right before lunch. So we're going to be hearing again from Sara Amadon, Senior Research Scientist at Child Trends, and this time she's going to be talking about the effects of Tulsa's early childhood education programs on high school outcomes. Then we're going to hear from Karin, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Virginia Tech University, and she's going to be talking about early socialization in Tulsa and relationships with some political outcomes. Then Bill Gormley, Professor of Public Policy at Georgetown University, will talk about UPK's impacts on college enrollment outcomes. And Tim Bartik, Senior Economist at the Upjohn Institute for Employment Research, is going to talk to us about some of the cost-benefit analysis and the conclusions we can draw about the estimated impacts on pre-K attendance earnings. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Sara.
I'm happy to be here now to share the results from our published high school paper, came out in Child Development earlier this year, with many of my co-authors who are in this room, Bill, Catherine, Amy who couldn't be here, Doug, and James, and many others, research assistants who are on this project. I also want to announce we'll be sharing some results from a working paper that until about noon today will be embargoed, so you're going to be some of the first in the world to learn about these exciting results. So, real briefly, what is it that we're trying to learn in this high school follow-up of the study? And I will say, it's the same cohort as I presented on the last time. So it's the same Ted Gare, Deborah Phillips, Carolyn, myself from the last panel. So what we ask in this study is, do the initial positive effects of attending a high-quality early childhood education program, do they fade out or persist into high school? And do we see new effects emerge? Importantly, as we'll talk about, a lot of the high school outcomes we were looking at, we didn't actually even observe earlier. And we're going to talk, unfortunately, much less about this, but as I alluded to, we do look at subgroup effects, and I'm happy to discuss those more with you later on today. So I'm going to briefly say what we learned. So what we saw is that like kind of we saw in the middle school paper, that we do see that these effects fade out or converge, as Anna talked about, a better way perhaps to think about it, but that they do persist. We do see some important associations with high school outcomes. And did new effects emerge? And what I will say is there's some, we'll get into it more, but there's some indication that for our students who attended the TPS pre-K program, that they might be more likely to graduate from high school. But I'll get more into that in a couple slides. So what do we mean by fade out or convergence? So first I want to say this is what we looked at the associations of attending pre-K on test scores. So this is from the paper that Ted talked about for kindergarten. That's Carolyn's paper there, the third grade. The seventh grade is the one I just talked about. These are the math test scores that we've been describing. And then that last bar is what we see in 11th grade, which is when students in Oklahoma and mostly across the country take usually the SAT or the ACT is normally what is taken today. So what do we see in 11th grade? We do see that there is fade out or convergence. We no longer see that attending TPS pre-K is associated with these test score outcomes. Again, this is the same method that we've been talking about for the third grade, the middle school paper as well, so I skipped over that. So this is some of that evidence of fade out or convergence. But we also see that attending TPS pre-K is still associated with several important high school outcomes. This is the slide just for pre-K. So if we go down, we'll see that students who attended TPS pre-K were absent fewer days, were less likely to be chronically absent. Chronically absent is missing 10% or more of school days per year. If we skip down, we also see they're more likely to have taken an AP or an IB course, similar to that association we see with honors course taking in middle school. We also see they're less likely to fail a course and that they fail fewer courses. And once again, we see they're much less likely to be grade retained as of 11th grade. And I should say most of these data are taken from the 11th grade year or from the 9th grade through the 11th grade year. So it doesn't include that senior year data. We don't see, however, though, as I mentioned, any impacts on the standardized test scores, no impacts on GPA, and we also looked at advanced math course taking, given the middle school finding, and there was no association there either. What do we see for Head Start? So what I've done on this slide is something a little different because we actually see that by and large, we don't see any significant associations between CAP Head Start attendance and our high school outcomes. I do want to remind us all, though, of that slide I shared in the middle school paper. There's only about 250, 280 students in the CAP Head Start sample, whereas we see over 1,000 in the other two. So in technical terms, we call that it has less statistical power. So that's what just an important caveat here. So we see the pre-K effects in that middle column there and the Head Start on the right. And we see that for absent, they do miss fewer days, the CAP Head Start students. We don't see any other significant associations. I share this slide, though, to show that for many of these outcomes, the coefficients are in the same direction. Not all of them. And also just to remind us all of that smaller sample size, that usually means more noise in the data, harder to find those effects. This slide here then, I'm going to take a minute to walk through this slide. This is for our high school graduation effect. So one important note is that high school graduation, this is from all of the state of Oklahoma. And Oklahoma State Department of Education, rightfully so, takes a lot of time to audit these data. We actually got these data after college enrollment data because of the time and energy and effort it takes to audit the data, to clean the data. And these data were obtained by the Oklahoma State Department of Education. What I also want to say is when we got these data, we cleaned them up a little bit and we made a few different decisions about how to define high school graduation, particularly 4 decisions. So this very first bar, graduate original OSDE, that actually includes the students who actually were incapacitated or even deceased. So what we did is we actually removed them from the data. They were included as non-graduates. We said, well, they couldn't graduate, so we moved them to missing. And that's that next column there, the graduate modified OSDE. Then there are also a couple other ways to think about graduation, whether you graduate with your 9th grade cohort, so whether or not you enter the 9th grade year, do you graduate on time? And then also with a kindergarten cohort. So if you start kindergarten, are you also graduating on time in the expected number of years? And so what we find is that graduation rates differ by pre-K and Head Start, but association, and there is a marginally significant association between attending pre-K and the first 3 of those graduation definitions. There's a statistically significant association between pre-K attendance and a higher likelihood of graduating on time with your kindergarten cohort, so that very last group. Importantly, that also does kind of include or conflate grade retention. However, it is still looking just at those graduates. And we were impacted by COVID. Again, happy to talk about that as well. But we did look at a couple of different years of high school graduation data because we had so many grade retained students. Couple of quick takeaways. One is that, as you can see, most students graduate from high school. Okay, so that's an important takeaway when we're thinking and contextualizing these, especially the marginal results, right? Most students do graduate from high school. And we also, the marginal effects, really we're talking about 2 to 3 percentage point difference for most of these definitions. For the last one, it's about an 8 percentage point difference. So we're not talking about a huge movement. And we also are talking about the marginal effects. So these are, not typically ones that researchers sing from the rooftops if they're statistically marginally significant, but important ones nonetheless that I wanted to mention. Head Start, we do not see any significant associations. So among the Head Start sample, you can see that middle bar is the Head Start, and it's much more close to the control group, which is that lighter bar, compared with that pre-K group, which is that orange one. And again, we dug a little bit into the subgroup differences, much more so for the high school outcomes paper than the graduation one, but happy to share more of those later. And now I will turn it over to Karin.
This is me. All right, I am also presenting new work. In fact, this paper was accepted last week, so we had some great timing with that. It's work with Bill Gormley, and it'll be at the Early Childhood Research Quarterly. So I think that will also be available today at noon as well. And so this is first time kind of presenting these results. A lot of the research that we've talked about this morning has focused a lot on the academic consequences of pre-K, but a lot less has been focused on the civic consequences of pre-K. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. So some recent research, such as Holbein, has been finding that strong early childhood education that emphasizes socio-emotional development can foster greater civic engagement. The early years are critical for importance in shaping children's skills, and children also acquire fundamental political orientations at an early age. And so we expect these orientations to persist over time. So we ask whether a large, high-quality universal pre-K program, such as the one in Tulsa, Oklahoma, has any long-term consequences for voter registration and whether or not these pre-K students are going to vote at higher rates. We consider the possibility that early childhood education strengthens cognitive and socio-emotional skills that facilitate civic engagement. Based on previous research of positive pre-K effects, we identify potential paths which we think pre-K might increase voting. We focus on two non-cognitive, stuff that Shirley presented earlier, and one cognitive. These measures were taken at kindergarten, and they involve the self-regulation, and that is from the Instrumental Competence Scale for Young Children. There were 4 questions asking self-regulation, so look at that as one potential path. And then the timid factor that Shirley presented on from the APSE scale, as well as a aggregate Woodcock-Johnson to look to see, okay, if we see these increases in these skills, then do we also see that these students are voting at higher rates as well? So according to the primacy principle and theories of human capital, early childhood education has the potential to shape attitudes and behaviors later in life. If correct, these theories suggest that early childhood education can help develop these skills necessary for voting, which we've heard a lot about self-regulation. And so we might expect if these students are learning how to do complicated processes, which registering to vote and actually voting is a multi-step process that you have to be aware of a lot of information to actually be able to do. So we're really interested to see, do we see these effects outside of academics? So what we did was we used the same cohort that everyone's been talking about, this later cohort of these 4,000 students. We used a similar database where we relied on data from Tulsa, the surrounding districts, the State Department of Education. We also used college enrollment data to look to see if students were still inside the state of Oklahoma but had been outside of the TPS system for a while. And we were able to track down around 2,800 students. We then obtained publicly available voter registration files, subset those to the cohorts matched on birth dates. So we looked at those that were born between this age and then matched it to our sample. And so we were able to then look to see, are these students showing up in our registration files, and then are they actually going out and voting? We looked for 2 years after a student turned 18 to identify those that registered or voted during this time period. So we gave kind of a longer window for the potential to register to vote. We focused on 2 main dependent variables, one registering to vote and the other, did they actually go out and vote? Now these 2 are correlated, so obviously you have to register to vote in order to vote, but only about 65% of people that register to vote actually go out and vote. We use a very similar method that everyone has described so far, the propensity score weighting, where we try to create these similar subgroups along the same set of covariates that others have described. And then we run separate models for these. So I'm gonna, whoops, wrong way. So here's kind of our path in thinking that we have lots of factors that go into whether or not you attend pre-K, and we try to model those. That attending pre-K has these benefits, self-regulation, as well as higher academic scores, and then we think that later down the road it's going to matter in terms of voting. This is just showing what was found in some earlier studies, that attending pre-K does have these expected effects, and this is replicating with our sample just to make sure that we were finding these, that self-regulation for those attending pre-K is higher. So that's that top row, that showing that as a dependent variable. Timidity is lower, and Woodcock-Johnson scores are higher. Again, those are all statistically significant, that attending pre-K has these effects. Okay, so then we looked at registering to vote. And so again, these are the coefficients on attending pre-K, and we're looking to see if it's positive and statistically significant. And we find a modest effect. So attending pre-K increases your likelihood of registering to vote by 4.5 percentage points, as well as it also increases your likelihood to actually go out and vote by around 4.5 percentage points. So if you're looking at kind of like the baseline comparisons, the mean respondents for non-pre-K is around 35.5 points are registered to vote. But if we're looking at the actual pre-K attendance, that then jumps to around 40.5 points. In terms of actually voting, 21.9% of those that did not attend pre-K are not voting. Attending pre-K increases that number to around 26.5 percentage points, or 26.5%. So we are seeing these positive effects outside of academics. And we really think that self-regulation also plays a big role here, because it helps in these like multi-step processes that students need in the beyond school as well. So I will now turn this over to Bill. I'm happy to talk about this more later time.
When parents of young children think about their child's future, a fervent hope typically is that they will someday go to college. Studies show that students with a BA degree earn twice as much as other students. Students with an associate's degree earn 1.5 times as much. College attendance itself is associated with other positive effects. You can move to the next slide. Pardon me? Oh, I moved to the next slide. There we go. Sorry about that. So, does pre-K boost college enrollment? There are studies that seek to answer this question, but few contemporary studies look at a large number of students over time. Pessimists point to fade-out effects that could gradually erase learning gains. Optimists argue that learning begets learning, skill begets skill. What do we find in Tulsa? Using our standard database and data from the National Student Clearinghouse, we were able to estimate the effects of TPS pre-K and CAP Head Start on college enrollment generally, and then separately on 2-year college enrollment and 4-year college enrollment. Despite the passage of time, we were able to address this question without the usual concerns of sample attrition, because we are now using national data rather than state and local data. For all intents and purposes, our sample for this question is actually our full original sample of 4,033 students. If you look just at the descriptive statistics without any controls, you see reasons for encouragement. TPS pre-K students are 11 percentage points ahead of their peers in college enrollment, and CAP Head Start students are 4 percentage points ahead of their peers in college enrollment. But what happens when we apply propensity score weighting and multiple imputation to estimate the effects of these early childhood education programs? If you take a binomial logit regression approach with controls for lots of demographic variables, you find a 12.1 percentage point boost in college enrollment for TPS pre-K and a 7.5 percentage point boost in college enrollment for CAP Head Start. The Tulsa Public Schools estimate is statistically significant. The CAP Head Start estimate, based on a smaller sample, is marginally significant. TPS pre-K boosts both 2-year college enrollment and 4-year college enrollment. CAP Head Start boosts four-year college enrollment. If we look at subgroups, TPS Pre-K has statistically significant positive effects for Blacks, whites, Latinos, and Native Americans. CAP Head Start has statistically significant positive effects for Blacks and Native Americans. To place these findings in perspective, let's compare Tulsa's early childhood education program effects with those of some other distal policy interventions or interventions that occurred some years ago. If we do that, we see that the effects of TPS Pre-K are somewhat bigger than the effects of Boston's universal pre-K program as reported by Guthrie Gray Loeb about a year ago. For further perspective, let's compare Tulsa's early childhood education program effects with those of some proximal interventions or interventions that occur just prior to college entry. If we do so, we see that the effects of TPS Pre-K are not quite as big as effects of the Kalamazoo Promise program, which Tim Bartik and Brad Hirschbein have studied. That program provides free college tuition to any public college or university in the state of Michigan to Kalamazoo high school graduates. Tulsa Pre-K effects are bigger than programs that offer free community college tuition in Pittsburgh and in Knoxville, and they are approximately equal to those of programs that make it easy for students to complete their college aid application forms. In short, Tulsa's Pre-K program looks very impressive when compared to other distal interventions, respectable or very respectable when compared to well-studied proximal interventions that make college entry easier just as students are leaving high school. In conclusion, Tulsa's early childhood education program significantly changed children's lives for the better in the long run by increasing the likelihood that they will enroll in college. How big is a boost of 12 percentage points in the likelihood of college enrollment? Given the baseline of about 33%, that's a boost of about 1/3. That's a substantial improvement to be celebrated, to be replicated, and to be emulated.
Well, this is also a new working paper, and I want to note at the start that this is joint work. It's joint work along with Bill and Sara here up in the panel, and also Douglas Hummel-Price and James Fuller. And so the purpose of this new study, which is going to be released, I think it's being released at noon or 11:50 or who knows, maybe it's on there now. I mean, it depends on the computer people, what they do, is to use the estimated effects from two of the papers you just saw by Sara and Bill that just presented that looks at effects on high school graduation rates and college attendance. And then to use that to do what I would call a partial benefit cost analysis of Tulsa Pre-K. It's a partial because all it looks at is earnings benefits. I'm an economist, but I don't think that only money matters. And obviously things like voter registration and voting and civic behavior and many other things could be benefits of Tulsa Pre-K. But surely earnings benefits are important, and that's what this tries to project based on these educational attainment effects from these two prior papers. The bottom line is that under any reasonable projection of likely earnings benefits, the earnings benefits are a lot greater than pre-K's cost. So, brief description of the methodology. We take the estimates from the prior paper by Sara and others on how Tulsa Pre-K affects high school graduation. The effects there aren't as large and they're marginally statistically significant, but they are there. We take the estimates from the paper that Bill just presented on the effects of Tulsa Pre-K on college attendance. We then use American Community Survey data on annual earnings in the Tulsa metro area by single year of age and by different educational attainment, we take that and we first of all adjust for inflation. We adjust everything to 2021 national US dollars. And we essentially use this to project earnings of this cohort who entered Tulsa pre-K, entered Tulsa kindergarten rather in the fall of 2006, to project what their earnings will be essentially for the next 60 years. And in doing that calculation, you have to adjust both for mortality rates by age, and you also have to adjust for the fact that earnings are going to grow in the US economy over time over the next 60 years. So we adjust for that. Then the key assumption, the most crucial assumption, is as of right now, we have a very long-term results here. We know something about college attendance. We don't know yet exactly how this will translate into effects on associate degree completion or bachelor degrees or higher completion. So 3 assumptions are used. One is what I'll call ultra-conservative, which even though there are these huge effects on college attendance, we assume has 0 effects on either getting an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree. And I would consider that ultra-conservative because that seems very unlikely. An optimistic assumption is that the percentage of college attendees who end up getting an associate's or bachelor's degree is equal to what we observe to be the common pattern in Tulsa for those in their late 20s, which is roughly 40% or so don't get a degree, a little bit more than 40% get a BA, and about 14% get an associate's degree. And then we have a moderately conservative assumption that is just halfway in between these two. Now, I should note that the optimistic assumption, you might think that's an upper bound. You might say, well, gee, these students are more disadvantaged, the ones you're encouraging to go to college and succeeding. You know, surely their degree completion will be less than the norm. But that's not necessarily the case. You need to account for 2 things as to why it's not an upper bound. One is that there could be students that Tulsa pre-K made no difference to their probability of attending college, but it could, due to these effects we've noted on grit, on these various soft skills, whatever they are, could have resulted in greater persistence in going on to get a degree. So it could be that there are effects even greater than you would expect based on the norm in Tulsa. And the other thing to note is we're looking at earnings effects, and we're projecting them totally based on educational attainment. Well, we know from other studies that numerous preschool programs have had effects on employment rates and earnings that are greater than what you'd expect based on educational attainment. For example, by reducing crime. And I would basically argue that the optimistic is not an upper bound. In fact, I would say moderately conservative assumption is probably a lower bound for what we'd expect to see the effects. So what do we get? If we look at the present value of lifetime earnings due to Tulsa preschool based on these educational effects, the ultra-conservative assumption is we get a little under 12,000. The optimistic is a little over 39,000. And the in-between assumption, what I'm calling moderate conservative, is between 25 and 26,000. Average preschool cost, if we adjust them to today's dollars, a little under $10,000. So the benefit cost ratio, just looking at earnings benefits, is somewhere between 1.23 and 4.08. I would say a lower bound is 2.65, an upper bound would be somewhere beyond 4. So Tulsa pre-K probably has earnings benefits at least 2.5 times its cost, and they could be as greater than 4 times the cost. Now, what we need to do is keep on pursuing this and see what actually happens to college graduation rates, and for that matter, what actually happens to earnings rates, because it could very well be that the earnings effects of Tulsa preschool are higher than we'd predict based on its effects on educational attainment. Of course, to do that, we need further research, so I encourage all the researchers involved with this to continue pursuing these poor people in the cohort who entered kindergarten in the fall of 2006. Let's keep on following them for the rest of their lives and see what happens to them, because I think we are continuing to get very interesting results from this. We need to keep on with the research studies. Thank you.
So I think we're ready to transition to our Q&A. We have a little less time, I think, than we'd hoped because of our technical difficulties. But I thought we would start with one in the room. Does anyone have a question that they'd like to address to the panel? In the back?
Do you think that low-income family, they might teach their kids to be more resilient or so since a very young age? And do you think that will also have an impact on their graduation or even economic income rates?
I don't know if that's directed to me or anyone else. I mean, are you saying you think it would be lower or higher? Well, it's hard to know. I mean, I guess you could get different results from different groups coming in earnings groups. I think from looking at studies, actually studies I've done of looking at how the return to college varies with education, the results in Tulsa are very similar to what you'd expect for how low families from low-income backgrounds, what returns they would get to college. Now, as I said, I mean, again, we're doing projections here, projections for the next 60 years. We would like to get some earnings data at least through the late 20s and early 30s, I would say, to see if the results hold up and are they greater or lesser in magnitude. I think it would take some really, as I said, I think that very conservative assumptions, clearly the benefits outweigh the cost.
Do we have questions from? Oh, this question is from Martha Zaslow. Hi, virtually, Marty. That's exciting. Why do the effects on self-regulation, which appear to be so important for long-term effects, emerge after rather than during pre-K?
Well, I would say they do emerge, at least in our study, immediately after. In Anna Johnson's seed study, it took a while for them to be detected, but they emerged quite strikingly in third grade. I think one short answer to Marty's question might be that we probably need to improve our measures of self-regulation. And if we were to do so, if we had a more exquisite set of indicators for self-regulation, we might be able to detect these trends even earlier.
And might I just follow up with a question to tie that question, which I think was maybe a little bit more relevant to the previous panel, to this one, which is, is there literature or is there reason to believe that the self-regulation impacts that Anna is seeing in her seed study are more or less relevant than cognitive impacts that might be measured by the SAT or ACT, for example, in high school graduation and college enrollment?
I'm inclined to say that cognitive effects continue to be really, really important. But one of the lessons that we've learned, I think, over many years of research is that one cannot simply conflate cognitive effects with standardized test score outcomes. So if you take a broader view, a wide-angle lens to understand the fuller range of cognitive effects, I think those cognitive effects are likely very important indeed.
I know for the high school paper, we definitely scratched our heads to try to think through what the diverse set of results. It wasn't totally coherent. It didn't, we had attendance, we had honors course taking, we had less grade retention and less course failure. Those things, it's kind of a combination of skills that it takes you to do those types of things. And attendance, and I often call those kind of more of behavioral, it takes a lot of behavioral skills, different behavioral types of engagement in school. Mm-hmm. So I'll definitely agree that cognitive self-regulation are critical, but it also seems to be that there are different ways of engaging with school and with engaging with the course material. So yeah, what we saw not necessarily high school graduation, although yes, that's an accumulation of over a decade of behaviors. So it is really a lot of skills that I believe in diverse set of learnings and behaviors in addition to self-regulation and some cognitive skills that lead us to what we found in the high school paper, because it wasn't test scores, it wasn't GPA that we saw, it was really kind of some different indicators of behavioral engagement in school.
We have another question from the audience here.
Hi, my name's Andrew. I'm a court student. I just have two questions actually for all or any of our esteemed panelists. So the first is, policymakers often have different goals. So of these findings, which goals, which policy outcomes does pre-K seem most helpful for, right? If we're trying to decide, we want to encourage college enrollment, we want to improve fewer students failing classes, right? How do we tell when pre-K is a better tool compared to other kinds of policies? And then secondly, related to that, in a perfect world, we'd love to just lavish all the resources we could on this, but if I have limited resources as a policymaker, I know that a couple of our later panels talked about how this compares as well or even better to later stage interventions like headed to college programs, high school programs. Can we start comparing this apples to apples? If I'm a policymaker and I have an X amount of dollars to spend and I need to decide based on my policy outcome which is going to be the better route to get that outcome, can we start saying that pre-K is a better choice than spending scarce dollars on, say, a high school program or a later in life program for a certain policy goal?
Well, on the second question, I would say we tried to make some comparisons between Tulsa's universal pre-K program and some distal interventions and even some proximal interventions. So if you're a policymaker trying to make some decisions, you can look at that lineup and see what the effect size is, and that's a good starting point. So I'll leave it at that.
I guess I would say, there's been an attempt to do that I think there's a whole web page you can find that Nat Hendren at Harvard did on the marginal, I forget what he calls the marginal benefit of public funds or marginal value of public funds, where he looks at hundreds and hundreds of studies, including, I think, Tulsa pre-K's in there. I know the Kalamazoo Promise is in there, looking at healthcare interventions. He's looking at later in life adult job training, looking at all kinds of interventions at all stages of the life cycle. I mean, my own view is that one advantage of pre-K is that it's something we know how to do. And it's very straightforward. I think sometimes when you get the later interventions, and I wouldn't say the Kalamazoo Promise is quite in that category, but when you get, for example, with adult job training, it's pretty clear that in order to do adult job training right, you have to be highly selective in which trainees you target for the training and how you orient the training. It has to be very, very selective. And on the other hand, I think you can just do preschool, just do universal preschool, run it in a high quality. I mean, maybe we don't know from class exactly what to do, but pay the teachers reasonably well, have low teacher turnover, train them, and it works. And we know how to do it. Whereas job training is a lot trickier. It needs to be much more selectively targeted.
I'll just add, this is nothing, I will say, that any of our research looked at, but I do want to bring this up because what is pre-K geared for? I would say, and I am not a pre-K educator, I'm not a pre-K administrator, but I bet my colleagues in the room would say that you want to provide an opportunity for learning how to go to school in the 4-year-old year, right? You're learning how to get along with peers, you're learning how you're getting some skills as we saw, you're getting some self-regulation. So I think that when we think about putting kids in pre-K, it's not about that they're going to be more likely to graduate from high school and college. It's been incredible what we've been able to do in these studies and what we've been able to find. But I would say that when most people think about what they want to do, it's that. I also will say that what a lot of other research, especially what Head Start shows, that again, we haven't looked at this, although Anna, I don't know if you have, is just what parents are able to do when their kids are actually in a free day-long experience during the school year. That it's something you don't have to pay for. It's something that takes that economic stress. With Head Start, you also have these wraparound services and supports. My colleagues at Child Trends last week came out with this incredible report that looked at the decline in child poverty over the past 25 years. One thing they did not look at is actually the expansion of pre-K within that time period, because it wasn't in their list of policies to look at. However, we also have to acknowledge that in that same time period, pre-K has expanded. And it has meant that parents are able to, a lot of parents, I won't say all, but a lot of parents are able to put their kids into these academically oriented programs and spaces for their 4-year-olds that they then don't have to worry about finding, that they don't have to pay for. That, I mean, if anyone, most people in this room have had to look for childcare, and it is a nightmare. And so the fact that the stress that it takes, the money it takes, that there's a lot of those other kind of secondary benefits that we haven't even touched on today that are really, really critical when we think about also why preschool matters. So I just wanted to add that as well, to add that thread to this conversation that hasn't been as highlighted. Yeah.
And I might take one quick liberty as moderator to also highlight that although I understand the inclination of policymakers with constrained resources to look for what is the most effective, that similar to the comments that Anna made around inoculation with preschool again, that I would just caution against the idea that just doing the pre-K program was all that even Tulsa did to help move children along the pipeline through success in school and in life. And so it's not always an either or, but sometimes it's a both and that's not easy for policymakers to hear, but I think important. So I think we have time for one more question.
And one thing, I think also these things are complementary. So Rutger Johnson, for example, at Berkeley has great research showing that the return to Head Start goes up with higher spending K-12, and the return to higher spending K-12 goes up with Head Start. So I think sometimes you need to reckon that, if we do a number of worthwhile interventions together, that the whole is more than the sum of the parts.
Thank you. I think we might have time for one more question. I don't think we have any more from the virtual, so one more question in the audience.
Oh, okay. Hi, my name's Laura Cronin. I was actually part of the initial team that landed on Tulsa with Dr. Gormley way back in 2001 or 2002. Hi. Quick question, given the strong findings with self-regulation and the now known pediatric mental health crisis in the country, has there been any ideas about perhaps framing this or mining the data for trying to frame it as sort of an early mental health intervention as well, given the importance of self-regulation to mental health?
I would say our study, I don't think we have the data for it. And I would just leave it at that. We don't have the data to look at that. I don't know, Anna and Deborah, if your study does. I think you have a lot more data to be able to look at that.
Okay. I guess that's our last question. We'll go ahead and wrap up. I don't know if there's announcements to be made about lunch.
Yes, I get to announce lunch. Those of you who are here in the auditorium, you want to march up to Copley Hall, and be sure if you're from out of town that you hold on to the coattail of someone who is from Georgetown so that you don't get lost. And for those of you who are joining us virtually, I hope that you will return at 1 o'clock Eastern Time for a lively conversation with Governor Jared Polis about Colorado's new universal pre-K program. Thank you very much.